In the beginning, the world does not feel fragile. It feels held by the weight of stone walls that have stood for generations, held by the repetition of seasons, by the steady return of ships across familiar waters, by the quiet belief that tomorrow will resemble yesterday. Civilizations rarely imagine their own ending. They build as though history is a straight road, not a shoreline, beautiful, temporary, and always eroding. And yet, when we look back across the ancient past, we find certain moments where the world seems to simply stop speaking. A silence enters the record. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of absence. Cities emptied, palaces burned, languages forgotten, a whole age dissolving into ash, leaving only fragments behind like bones in the sand. But before that silence, there was a time when the world still held, when civilization felt permanent, when the Bronze Age was not a mystery, but a living, breathing order of life. This is where the story begins. Before the collapse, the ancient world was not quiet. It was alive with motion, constant, intricate, almost orchestral. Across the Mediterranean and the Near East, kingdoms rose like torchlight along the edges of the sea. Their cities were not isolated points, but part of a vast and interconnected web. Trade routes stitched distant cultures together. Bronze flowed from mines to workshops, from workshops to armies, from armies to empires. The world was bound by exchange. Copper and tin, grain and wine, ivory, spices, carved stone, dyed cloth. Objects moved across waters the way stories move through generations, carried carefully, traded reverently, shaping identities without anyone fully noticing. Ships cut through the blue like dark insects against the sun. Their cargo holds were heavy with wealth, but also with trust. Because to trade is to believe in continuity. To send something away is to assume something will return. And for centuries, it did. In the great coastal cities, markets were crowded with languages. The air carried the smell of salt and incense, oil lamps and animal hides. Merchants measured time in contracts. Priests measured it in ritual. Farmers measured it in rain. Civilization was not a single empire. It was a rhythm. A shared heartbeat stretching from Mycenae to Ugarit, from Hatti to Egypt. A world where even distant powers knew one another through letters pressed into clay, sealed with authority, delivered across dangerous roads. In palace archives, scribes recorded tribute and harvests, inventories of bronze weapons, jars of olive oil, herds of cattle. The act of writing itself felt like a kind of permanence, a way of pinning life down, of making it legible, controllable, enduring. And above it all, temples burned. Incense rose toward the heavens as if the gods could be fed by smoke. In sanctuaries lit by fire, people placed offerings before statues that did not move, yet carried the weight of everything unseen. The Bronze Age was not only economic, it was spiritual. The world was thick with divinity. Storm gods ruled the skies, sea gods haunted the deep, fertility gods lived in the soil. Kings were not merely rulers, they were intermediaries, balancing the fragile relationship between human order and cosmic will. To live in this world was to believe that the universe had structure, that chaos could be held back, that rituals mattered, that the walls would stand. And so cities rose like constellations along the coasts, each one a small universe of stone and labor, palaces with painted frescoes, fortifications built not only for defense, but for declaration. We are here, we will remain. In Mycenaean Greece, citadels crowned hill like clenched fists of architecture. In Anatolia, the Hittite capital stood as a seat of imperial gravity. Along the Levant, ports like Ugarit hummed with trade, diplomacy, and cosmopolitan life. Egypt, ancient even then, watched the world through the steady gaze of the Nile, its pharaohs presiding over a civilization that seemed eternal. This was an age of correspondence. Kings wrote to kings as brothers, as rivals, as necessary partners in the maintenance of order. In the Amarna letters, we still hear their voices, formal, cautious, insistent. Send gold. Send grain. Send soldiers. The language of empire is always the language of need. And yet, beneath the grandeur, something quietly human persists, because civilization is not only palaces. It is ordinary lives. It is farmers bending over fields beneath the same sun their ancestors knew. It is children learning the stories of gods and heroes. It is artisans shaping molten bronze into weapons and tools, their hands blackened with soot, their labor unseen by history until it disappears. We often imagine the ancient world as distant, mythic, unreal. But to those who lived inside it, it was simply life, a normal world. A world with weddings and funerals, droughts and festivals, wars and seasons. A world where the future felt predictable enough to plan for, to build for, to dream into. That is perhaps the most haunting truth. Collapse does not arrive in a world expecting collapse. It arrives in a world still planting crops, still writing letters, still burning incense, still believing. The Bronze Age system was complex, and complexity always carries a hidden cost. The more interconnected a world becomes, the more vulnerable it is to rupture. When trade routes are arteries, disruption becomes hemorrhage. When alliances are scaffolding, betrayal becomes collapse. But in this first chapter, the scaffolding still stands. The world still holds. There is a kind of innocence in that stability. Not innocence in the moral sense. These were violent societies built on hierarchy and conquest, but innocence in the sense that they could not yet imagine their own erasure. Because to imagine the end of your world is almost impossible when your world has always been there. The Bronze Age people did not know they were living in the late hours of an age. They did not call themselves Bronze Age. They did not know they were standing at the edge of a threshold. They believed the gods were listening. They believed the kings were strong. They believed the harvest would return. And perhaps this is why the collapse that comes later feels so haunting. Because it is not merely the fall of cities. It is the shattering of assumption, the realization that civilization is not a mountain. It is a flame, bright, intricate, and always vulnerable to wind. In the centuries before the silence, the world was filled with sound, with commerce, with ritual, with the steady movement of ships and the steady certainty of stone. And across the coasts, the lights of cities still burned at night, reflecting on dark water like stars that believed they would never go out. This was the world before disappearance, before the records broke, before the Great Quiet entered history, before the Age of Bronze collapsed into myth. For now, the ancient world still holds, but even in its brilliance, the first shadows are already gathering at the edges of the sea. In the Bronze Age, distance did not mean isolation. The sea was not a boundary, it was a road, wide, restless, and alive with passage. And across that moving road, the ancient world learned a rare and dangerous skill, interdependence. Kingdoms did not merely coexist, they leaned on one another. They traded not only goods but stability itself, as though peace could be measured in shipments and sealed in clay. This was the Bronze Age dream. Not a dream of perfect harmony, no ancient age is without violence, but a dream of order strong enough to hold complexity. A belief that if the right people ruled, if the gods were honored, if the ships kept arriving, then civilization could continue indefinitely. Not because it was invincible, but because it was connected. And connection can feel like immortality. Along the coasts, palatial centers rose, fortified, ceremonial, and quietly bureaucratic. These were not simply homes for kings, they were engines, administrative hearts that pulled resources inward and sent commands outward. In their storerooms lay the lifeblood of society, grain stacked in jars, oil sealed in amphorae, textiles folded like wealth made soft. Food was power, and power was stored. A palace that could feed people could command them. A palace that could distribute grain during drought could seem godlike. In a world where survival was never guaranteed, abundance was a form of authority. It made the ruler feel necessary. It made the system feel sacred. And so the Bronze Age built its greatness not only on swords, but on storage. In the shadow of these palaces, scribes worked quietly, the way veins work beneath skin. They pressed symbols into clay tablets while the world moved around them. They counted cattle and counted workers. They recorded tribute from villages, shipments from ports, distributions from storerooms. Their writing was not poetry. It was control. It was the attempt to make an unpredictable world legible enough to manage. A civilization becomes powerful when it can remember. And these societies remembered through systems, through lists, inventories, tallies. The tablets were small, but their implications were enormous. They meant that power did not have to rely solely on personal strength. It could rely on structure. It could be maintained through records, repeated through procedure, inherited through bureaucracy. This is what the Bronze Age dream truly was. A world where complexity could be governed, where a king could sit in a palace and still reach into distant valleys through taxation, labor, and the slow, relentless logic of administration, where a decision made near a throne could shape fields miles away, and the harvest of those fields could return to the palace to become the king's strength. And beyond the palace walls, the sea kept moving. Ships carried wealth between distant shores, metal, timber, grain, wine, ceramics, spices. They carried not only objects but assurance. A ship arriving meant the world still worked. It meant the routes were still open. It meant the faraway king still honored agreements. A trading vessel is a fragile thing. Wood and rope, sailcloth and hope. It can be swallowed by storms, by pirates, by the indifferent appetite of the sea. Yet the Bronze Age sent ships anyway, again and again, across open water. That repetition itself was a form of faith, a belief that the future would still be there to meet you when you arrived. On foreign docks, traders met under unfamiliar skies. They exchanged goods and gestures, debts and promises. Sometimes they exchanged stories. Sometimes they exchanged gods. Because trade does not just move material, it moves meaning. In the Bronze Age world, cultural borders were porous. Styles traveled, techniques spread, names of deities shifted shapes as they crossed regions. A storm god in one land could be recognized in another under a different name. A ritual in one city might echo a ritual across the sea, altered but familiar. To modern eyes, it can look almost miraculous. A world without modern technology, yet threaded together by diplomatic correspondence, economic exchange, and shared symbolic language. A world functioning like a living system, many parts, one body. But living systems can become sick, because interdependence is a form of power, but it is also a form of vulnerability. The Bronze Age was not a chain, it was a web. It could hold weight beautifully, until one strand snapped, and then another, and then the tension shifted in ways no one could predict. Still in its prime, the web felt strong. In the great capitals, envoys traveled with gifts and formal words. Kings addressed each other in letters, not as strangers, but as participants in a shared world. Alliances were marriages, treaties were oaths, and honor mattered not because people were noble, but because reputation was survival. A kingdom that could not be trusted became a kingdom that it could not trade. And a kingdom that could not trade could not sustain complexity. This is the quiet truth beneath the dream. Stability was not natural. It was maintained. It was negotiated daily, across borders and seas through human discipline and human fear. It depended on countless people doing their roles, farmers planting, sailors sailing, scribes recording, priests performing, soldiers guarding. The dream was built from ordinary repetition. And because it was built from repetition, it felt eternal. When a child grew up watching ships return each season, watching grain flow into storerooms, watching festivals repeat, watching kings reign in the same palaces their fathers knew, it would have been difficult to imagine that any of it could vanish. The dream was not naive, it was simply reinforced by experience. Day after day the world continued. And so people concluded, the world will continue. This is how civilizations become confident, not through philosophy, but through habit. Even war in this system did not always feel like total destruction. Conflicts happened, cities fought, borders shifted, but the broader network often endured. The web flexed, it adapted, it absorbed shocks. That adaptability bred a dangerous illusion that it would always adapt. But harmony in the Bronze Age was not solidity. It was balance. And balance can be delicate. It can depend on good harvests, on stable leadership, on navigable seas, on the ability of a palace to keep its people fed. It can depend on climate patterns that quietly shift beyond human perception. It can depend on distant regions remaining stable enough to supply tin, because bronze, the metal that gave the age its name, was not born in one place. It required ingredients often found far apart. A Bronze Age weapon carried geography within it. Copper from one land, tin from another, shaped by craftsmen in a third. Used by warriors defending a palace whose wealth came from farms scattered across entire regions. Every sword, every tool, every ornament was a testament to connection. A testament and a warning. Because what happens when the tin stops arriving? What happens when the grain fails? What happens when the roads become dangerous, when letters go unanswered, when ships vanish? The Bronze Age dream was a golden age built on trust, complexity, and the illusion of stability. It was an extraordinary human achievement, the triumph of organization over distance, of administration over chaos, of exchange over isolation. But it was also a world that had made itself dependent on continuity. And continuity is always a gamble. For now, the web still holds. The palaces still store grain, the scribes still press wet clay into lasting marks. The ships still cut through the sea like moving prayers, carrying wealth between distant shores. The dream still glows, but somewhere beyond the horizon, unseen pressures begin to gather, slowly, quietly, like weather forming far out at sea. And every dream, no matter how beautiful, becomes most vulnerable when it finally feels real. In every age of power, there comes a moment when permanence begins to feel natural, not because it is true, but because the world has repeated itself long enough to appear unchanging. A king sits upon a throne, and the throne has always been there. The palace walls have stood through seasons and wars, through births and burials. The ceremonies continue. The gods are honored. The grain is stored. The scribes keep writing. And so, the rulers of the Bronze Age began to believe something quietly dangerous. That order was the default state of the world. That civilization, once achieved, could not truly be undone. They built empires as though history had reached a kind of completion, an apex of structure and control. Marble floors reflected torchlight, columns rose like frozen trees, courtyards echoed with ritual footsteps. Diplomats spoke in carefully measured language, and kings addressed one another as brothers, as equals, as pillars holding up the same sky. It looked solid. It felt eternal. But beneath the marble and ceremony, unrest was always present, like a tremor under stone. Because empire is not a monument. It is a machine. And machines grow heavy. The Bronze Age world was magnificent, but it was also strained by its own complexity. The palaces that stored grain also demanded grain. The armies that protected borders also consumed resources. The networks that connected kingdoms also required constant maintenance, constant trust, constant movement, constant stability. To rule was to balance countless pressures at once. A king did not only govern people, he governed scarcity. He governed ambition. He governed the invisible anxiety of a world that could never fully be controlled. Rivalries simmered across the interconnected map of powers. Alliances were fragile, shifting like weather. Treaties held until they didn't. Royal marriages bound kingdoms together, but they could not erase the ancient truth that power is always hungry. Even among brothers, suspicion lived. The Hittites watched Egypt. Mycenae watched the Aegean. Assyria watched the borders of opportunity. Each kingdom was a fire, surrounded by other fires, all burning, all consuming, all needing fuel. And fuel was never infinite. Resources strained beneath the surface of grandeur. Bronze itself, the metal of the age, was a reminder of dependence. Copper could be found, but tin was rarer, distant, vulnerable to disruption. Without tin, bronze was impossible. Without bronze, armies weakened. Without armies, borders failed. Without borders, palaces burned. The entire system rested on supply lines that stretched across seas and mountains. Empires were balanced on geography, balanced on trade, balanced on seasons, balanced on the assumption that tomorrow would arrive intact. But assumptions are fragile things. In the palace storerooms, abundance could look endless, yet it was always a calculation. How much grain could be collected before villages broke under taxation? How much labor could be demanded before resentment hardened? How many wars could be fought before the countryside emptied of young men? The machinery of empire grows heavy, not all at once, but gradually through accumulation. More officials, more tribute rosters, more soldiers, more complexity. And complexity is a kind of weight civilization places upon itself. The people at the top rarely feel the strain first. Kings are insulated by walls, by ceremony, by distance. They see the world through messengers and reports, through inventories and formal letters. Reality arrives filtered. A famine becomes a statistic. A rebellion becomes an inconvenience. A weakening border becomes tomorrow's problem. And so the illusion of stability persists, even as fractures spread beneath it. History often collapses not with one blow, but with slow, invisible fractures. A drought that lasts 1 year too long, a trade route interrupted, a harvest that fails, a rival kingdom sensing weakness, a generation of rulers less capable than the last, a population growing restless beneath endless demands. Collapses rarely sudden for those inside it. It is gradual. It is a feeling of strain becoming normal and a world adjusting to pressure until it can no longer adjust. In the Bronze Age, the great rulers still believed their order was eternal. They performed rituals as they always had. They built monuments as if stone could anchor time. They sent letters demanding tribute, demanding loyalty, demanding gold. The language of empire is always confident, even when empire is afraid. Because fear at the top cannot be shown, a king must appear chosen, unshakable, favored by the gods. The performance of certainty becomes part of the structure itself. But beneath that performance, the cracks widen. Villages feel the weight of taxation. Soldiers feel the exhaustion of endless campaigns. Merchants feel the instability of routes once safe. Priests feel the trembling question, what if the gods are no longer holding the world together? The Bronze Age dream was still alive, but now it carried tension. Like a beautiful ship overloaded with cargo, still sailing, still upright, but riding lower in the water than before. And somewhere beyond the palace walls, beyond the marble floors and incense smoke, beyond the written records of scribes, the world was changing in ways that could not be tallied. The sea does not care for treaties. The climate does not honor kings. The hunger of displaced peoples does not wait for diplomacy. Empires balanced on ash, because ash is what remains after fire. And every empire, no matter how grand, is built with the possibility of burning inside it. For now, the Bronze Age world still stands. The palaces still gleam. The ceremonies still echo. The rulers still believe. But history is already moving beneath them, slowly, quietly, invisibly, like the first tremors before a city falls. There are moments in history when the horizon changes, not with thunder, not with proclamation, but with something quieter, an unfamiliar shape against the familiar sea, a presence that does not belong to the known order. The Bronze Age world, so carefully interconnected, so dependent on roots and rhythms, was built on the assumption that the edges of civilization were stable, that the sea was a corridor, not a question. But the sea has always been more than a road. It is also an opening. And sometimes from that opening, the world sends something new. From the horizon came shadows without clear names. They did not arrive as an empire. They did not announce themselves with banners or treaties. They came like weather, sudden, shifting, impossible to negotiate with. Ancient scribes would later call them something almost mythic. The Sea Peoples. Not a single nation, not a unified army, but a name given to movement itself. A storm given human form. We know them mostly through fragments, through Egyptian inscriptions carved into temple walls, through desperate letters from collapsing cities, through the haunted absence they leave behind. They appear in the record not as fully understood people, but as a force. And perhaps that is how they felt to those who watched them approach. A force. In the final centuries of the Bronze Age, the Mediterranean was no longer only filled with merchants. It began to fill with uncertainty. Ships still crossed the waters, but not all ships came to trade. Some came carrying hunger, some came carrying displacement, some came carrying the restless momentum of societies already breaking elsewhere. Because the Sea Peoples were not born in a vacuum. They were symptoms. They were the outward wave of inward collapse. Some scholars imagine them as raiders, opportunists striking weakened coasts. Others see them as migrants, entire communities uprooted by famine, drought, earthquake, or war. People pushed from their homelands by pressures we can only partially trace. Enemy or refugee. Invader or survivor. History rarely gives us clean categories. And the ancient world, in its fear, did what civilizations often do. It turned complexity into a single shadow. The texts speak of them with awe and dread. Egyptian pharaohs describe battles against foreign peoples arriving by sea, accompanied by families, carts, children, suggesting not merely an army, but a movement of life itself. Not conquest alone. Migration. Desperation. A wandering apocalypse. In inscriptions from the reign of Ramesses III, the Sea Peoples are portrayed as a coalition of names: the Peliset, the Shurden, the Danaan, the Jeker. Names that flicker like half-remembered dreams. We do not know exactly where they came from. We do not know how they saw themselves. But we know what they represented to those who faced them. The unknown. And the unknown is always terrifying, because the Bronze Age world was built on predictability. Kings knew their rivals. Merchants knew their roots. Priests knew their rituals. Even war had rules, seasons, expectations. But the Sea Peoples did not fit the map. They arrived from beyond the established order, from the margins where civilization's certainty dissolves into sea mist. They were not part of the diplomatic web. They were not bound by the treaties that held kingdoms together. They were outside the system. And when something outside enters a system dependent on balance, unraveling begins. Cities along the coast felt it first. Ports that once welcomed trade began to brace for that attack. Fortifications became desperate rather than ceremonial. Letters were sent in panic. In Ugarit, one of the great trading cities of the Levant, tablets record a voice trembling through clay. Enemies are at sea. and the city has no ships, no defense, no help coming. It is one of the last whispers before a silence. Because the Sea People's approach was not only physical, it was psychological. It was the feeling that the world's boundaries were failing, that the sea no longer brought only wealth, but threat, that the horizon could no longer be trusted. And once trust collapses, everything collapses with it. Trade falters. Alliances strain. Resources are diverted to defense. Food is hoarded. Fear spreads faster than armies. The Bronze Age dream had depended on connection, but connection is fragile when the roots become dangerous. A palace cannot store grain if the countryside is burning. A king cannot command loyalty if he cannot protect. A system cannot sustain complexity when survival becomes immediate. The Sea Peoples were both cause and consequence. They did not single-handedly destroy the Bronze Age world, but they arrived at the moment it was already weakening, already cracking. They were the pressure that found the fractures. A storm does not create a broken roof. It reveals it. And so, their arrival marked the beginning of unraveling. Not because they were supernatural, not because they were monsters, but because they were human beings moving through a collapsing world, carrying hunger, fear, and momentum. The ancient texts speak of invaders like a storm given human form, because to the settled civilizations of the coast, it must have felt exactly like that. A force emerging from nowhere. A darkness on the water. A future that could not be negotiated with. And yet, beneath the dread, there is another truth, one quieter, more unsettling. What if the Sea Peoples were not merely destroyers? What if they were the first visible refugees of a wider catastrophe? What if they were running from something even worse behind them? Collapse rarely moves in one direction. It ripples. One region breaks, sending people outward. Those people collide with another region, breaking it in turn. The apocalypse spreads not only through fire but through displacement, through hunger crossing borders, through survival becoming movement. The Sea People's approach was the Bronze Age world encountering its own fragility in human form. A reminder that civilization is not a wall. It is an agreement. And agreements fail when desperation arrives at their gates. For now, the coasts still stand. The temples still burn incense. The palaces still store grain. But the horizon is no longer empty. Shapes gather where the sea meets the sky. And the ancient world, so certain of itself, begins to feel something unfamiliar. Not war, not rivalry, but the cold breath of disorder, approaching slowly like a tide that cannot be turned back. There is a particular kind of horror in ruins, not the dramatic horror of battle cries or collapsing walls in the moment of violence, but the quiet horror of what comes after, when the smoke has cleared, when the streets are empty, when the only sound left is wind moving through broken stone. Because ruins are not only destruction, they are absence made visible. And in the final years of the Bronze Age, absence began to spread across the coastlines like a sickness no one could name. One by one, cities that had once glittered with life fell into flame and silence. Not all at once, not with a single trumpet of apocalypse, but in fragments, in chapters, in endings that did not yet understand they were part of something larger. The ancient world had always known war. Cities had been attacked before. Empires rose and fell in cycles that felt almost natural. But what was happening now was different. This was not conquest with replacement, not a rival king taking a throne. This was disappearance. Great centers of culture became ruins before anyone could understand why. Along the eastern Mediterranean, coastal strongholds, ports that had once served as arteries of trade, began to burn. The very cities that had connected civilizations now became the first to vanish. Ugarit, a name that once meant wealth, diplomacy, cosmopolitan life. A city filled with merchants and scribes, with temples and warehouses, with ships arriving under foreign flags. And then, ash. Its final tablets do not describe heroic resistance, they describe confusion, panic, a desperate awareness that help is not coming. The city is abandoned by the system it once sustained. And when Ugarit falls, it is not merely one city falling. It is a signal that the web is tearing. Across Anatolia, the Hittite world trembles. Hattusa, the imperial capital, is emptied and destroyed, not occupied, not transformed, simply left behind, as though the empire evaporated from within. In Greece, Mycenaean palaces that had stood like crown fortresses, Pylos, Mycenae, Tiryns, burn in succession. Their storerooms collapse, their frescoes blacken, their administrative tablets are fired accidentally in the flames, preserved only because the city died. It is one of history's cruel ironies. The record survives because the world that wrote it did not. These were not minor settlements. These were the beating hearts of Bronze Age civilization. And yet they fell like candles in a long corridor, extinguished one after another, leaving darkness between. The collapse was not a single apocalypse. It was a chain of endings spreading across the map. That is what makes it so haunting. Because an apocalypse implies clarity, a single moment, a recognizable catastrophe. But this was not clarity. This was fragmentation. A world unraveling faster than it could comprehend itself. Each city that burned may have believed it was alone. Each ruler may have believed this was a local crisis, a raid, an unfortunate war. But from our distance, we see the pattern. We see that something systemic was happening, something that moved beyond borders, beyond individual conflicts. Trade routes failed. Food shortages deepened. Migratory pressures increased. Earthquakes shook already weakened walls. The sea peoples arrived like a tide. Internal rebellions flared. And the interconnected Bronze Age world, so dependent on balance, began to collapse in cascading failure. A palace cannot function without grain. Grain cannot arrive without farmers. Farmers cannot plant without security. Security cannot exist without armies. Armies cannot be maintained without bronze. Bronze cannot be forged without trade. Trade cannot survive without stability. Stability cannot survive when cities are burning. It is a circle of dependence. And once the circle breaks, collapse spreads like fire. One of the most unsettling truths is how quickly civilization can become unrecognizable. A city is not only stone, it is memory. It is language spoken in streets. It is ritual repeated at temples. It is the invisible trust that people will gather again tomorrow. When a city burns, all of that burns too. And when no one returns, the city becomes a ghost. Archaeologists, centuries later, find layers of destruction, charred beams, collapsed roofs, weapons left behind. Evidence of violence frozen in earth. But evidence cannot tell us what it felt like. What did it feel like to stand on a shoreline and see smoke rising from a neighboring city? What did it feel like to realize the ships were no longer coming? What did it feel like to hear that the king's allies were silent? Fear in the Bronze Age was not the fear of monsters. It was the fear of abandonment. The fear that the world structure was dissolving. That the gods were no longer holding the sky in place. That civilization itself was not eternal. It was temporary. And the people living through it did not have our hindsight. They did not know they were witnessing the end of an age. They did not call it collapse. They only knew that the familiar order was breaking. The lights of the coast were going out. And when cities burn without witness, history becomes strange. Because without witnesses, destruction loses narrative. It becomes pure absence. The Bronze Age collapse is haunting precisely because it is not fully explained. It is a catastrophe made of many catastrophes, layered and intertwined. No single enemy, no single cause. Only a world too complex to save itself. And so, the map of civilization begins to empty. Ports fall silent. Palaces become rubble. Writing disappears. Trade shrinks. The great interconnected dream fractures into isolated survival. The chain of endings continues, spreading across the Mediterranean like a slow dusk. And in the ruins, something deeper is revealed. Civilization is not a permanent state. It is a fragile achievement. A candle held against the dark. In the Bronze Age, that candle burned brilliantly. But now, one by one, the cities that once carried its flame are turning to ash. And the silence that follows is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of a world forgetting its own name. Hunger is one of history's oldest gods. It does not announce itself with armies or banners. It does not need conquest. It arrives quietly, first as a shortage, then as a fear, then as a slow unraveling of everything a civilization believes about itself. And in the final years of the Bronze Age, hunger began to creep beneath the throne. As trade routes broke, the great arteries of the ancient world narrowed. Ships that once carried grain, copper, oil, and wealth across the Mediterranean began to vanish from the horizon. Roads that once linked kingdoms through exchange became dangerous, uncertain, closed. The interconnected dream faltered. And when connection dies, famine follows. Because the Bronze Age was not built for isolation. It was built for movement, for constant circulation of goods, tribute, and food. Palaces depended on countryside harvests. Cities depended on imports. Kingdoms depended on stability beyond their borders. When the system fractured, scarcity moved in. At first, it may have seemed temporary. A poor harvest, a delayed shipment, a drought that would pass. But hunger is rarely a single season. Hunger becomes a presence. It lingers. It compounds. It spreads through markets, through storerooms, through whispered conversations at night. Grain vanished. Not all at once, but enough to be felt. Enough that the jars in palace magazines did not refill as they once had. Enough that bread became smaller. Enough that the poor began to thin first, then the soldiers, then even the households of the elite. Economies withered as surely as crops. Because hunger is not only physical, it is structural. When food disappears, everything built upon food begins to collapse. Trade cannot flourish when survival is immediate. Art does not thrive when stomachs are empty. Armies do not march well when the land behind them is starving. The Bronze Age palaces had always stored grain as power. In times of abundance, the king's storerooms were proof of divine favor. The ruler could distribute food, sustain loyalty, maintain order. But famine turns abundance into accusation. Why is the palace full while the village starves? Why do the gods still accept offerings while children go hungry? Why does the king still wear gold while the fields fail? In hunger, hierarchy becomes unbearable. The divine promise of kingship began to fail. Bronze Age rulers were not merely administrators. They were sacred figures, mediators between humanity and the gods. Their legitimacy rested on the belief that they upheld cosmic balance, that through ritual, authority, and divine favor, the world would remain ordered. But famine is a crack in that sacred illusion. Because what is a king if he cannot feed his people? What is a priest if the gods remain silent? What is civilization if it cannot provide the most basic promise that life will continue? When people cannot eat, faith in civilization itself begins to rot. Not suddenly, slowly, like wood decaying beneath paint. At first, hunger breeds anxiety, then resentment, then desperation. People begin to hoard, markets distort, theft increases, Villages resist taxation. Soldiers desert. Banditry grows along roads once safe. And the palace, once the heart of stability, becomes a symbol of distance. In the written record, we find hints of this strain. Letters from rulers begging allies for grain, appeals for shipments that never arrive, desperate requests carved into clay, preserved only because the world that wrote them was collapsing. Send food. The words echo across millennia with terrifying simplicity. Because hunger strips away the poetry of empire. It reveals the human animal beneath civilization's veneer. And hunger does something else, too. It moves people. A starving village cannot remain in place forever. A starving population becomes restless, migratory, dangerous, not by nature, but by necessity. Hunger pushes families onto roads. Hunger turns refugees into raiders. Hunger makes borders meaningless. Perhaps this is part of what drove the movements we call the Sea Peoples. Perhaps famine was one of the invisible forces behind the invasions, the burnings, the migrations. When the land cannot feed you, the horizon becomes an answer. And so hunger becomes not only suffering, but momentum. In palaces, rulers may have tried to maintain ceremony even as scarcity grew. Rituals continued. Incense burned. Offerings were made. Kings still spoke with the language of permanence. But beneath the throne, the foundations were rotting. A ruler cannot command loyalty from an empty stomach. A god cannot feel present when prayers go unanswered. And famine is always louder than ideology. It is one of the oldest lessons of collapse. Civilization is only as strong as its harvest. We like to imagine history turning on battles and kings, on dramatic moments of conquest. But more often, history turns on bread, on rain, on soil, on the fragile relationship between humans and the earth. When that relationship breaks, everything else follows. In the Bronze Age, famine was not merely a background hardship. It was a corrosive force eating away at the trust that held society together. It weakened armies. It destabilized trade. It provoked unrest. It shattered the sacred aura of kingship. And perhaps most hauntingly, it introduced a new kind of fear. Not fear of enemies beyond the walls, but a fear that the world itself was no longer reliable, that the seasons could fail, that the gods could withdraw, that the structures built by human hands were temporary. Hunger is patient. It does not need to burn cities itself. It only needs to make people desperate enough that cities burn anyway. And so, beneath the marble floors of palaces, beneath the gold and ceremony, beneath the last performances of divine authority, famine spread its shadow. A slow, invisible apocalypse. The kind that does not arrive with fire from the sky, but with emptiness in the granary, and silence in the prayers, and the unbearable realization that civilization, too, can starve. There is a quiet arrogance in every civilization. Not arrogance of cruelty, but of assumption, the belief that the world beneath our feet is stable, that the ground will remain solid, that the rains will return, that the rivers will continue to run. Empires rise by learning how to live within nature. They fall when nature changes its mind. In the final centuries of the Bronze Age, the earth itself began to feel unfamiliar. The world that had once sustained palace economies and harvest rhythms seemed to shift slowly, inexorably, like a curse spoken without words. The earth turns against its builders, not in anger, not with intention, but with indifference. Earthquakes shattered walls that had stood for generations. Great stone fortifications cracked open as though they were made of clay. Palaces, symbols of permanence, collapsed in a single trembling hour. Cities that believed themselves eternal discovered that eternity can be undone by the movement of unseen faults beneath the soil. In the archaeological layers of the late Bronze Age, Destruction is often written not only in fire but in fracture. Collapsed masonry. Broken foundations. Streets buried beneath fallen stone. The earth does not conquer like an army, but its violence is absolute. A king cannot negotiate with tectonic plates. A priest cannot offer incense to stop the shaking. The gods of empire feel suddenly distant when the ground itself becomes uncertain. And then there was drought. A slow disaster, quieter than invasion, but just as fatal. Rains failed. Fields browned. Rivers that had once been lifelines began to shrink. The great systems of Bronze Age power depended on agriculture, on predictable harvests, on grain stored in palace magazines, on the steady conversion of soil into surplus. But drought empties surplus first. Then it empties trust. Then it empties people. Climate shifted like a slow curse, not dramatic enough to be called apocalypse at first, but persistent enough to change everything. A few seasons of poor rain become hunger. Hunger becomes migration. Migration becomes conflict. Conflict becomes collapse. Nature did not choose sides, yet it became an accomplice in the fall. This is one of the most unsettling truths in the story of the Bronze Age collapse. The world was not only breaking politically, it was breaking environmentally. The interconnected web of kingdoms was already strained by rivalries, invasions, famine, and systemic fragility. And then the earth itself added pressure. A civilization can survive war. It can survive drought. It can survive earthquakes. But to face them all at once is to face a world unraveling on every level, human and natural, political and cosmic. To the Bronze Age mind, nature was never merely background. The environment was divine language. Storms were God speaking. Drought was punishment. Earthquakes were omens. When the land turned unstable, it was not only practical disaster, it was spiritual crisis. What does it mean when the gods no longer sustain the order? What does it mean when the rituals fail? When the rivers shrink? When the crops die? When the earth shakes beneath the temples? The Bronze Age world was built on the belief that civilization mirrored cosmic balance. Kingship was sacred because it maintained harmony between human society and divine order. But nature's indifference shattered that illusion. The world that once felt like a home began to feel strange. Ports burned, granaries emptied, walls cracked. The horizon filled with migrants and raiders, and above it all, the climate itself shifted, quietly undermining the foundations. It is difficult for modern mind, surrounded by technology, to truly imagine what it meant to depend so completely on rain. To look at the sky each season not with poetry, but with desperation. A failed harvest was not inconvenience. It was death. And repeated failure was societal collapse. In such conditions, the countryside empties. Farmers abandon fields. People move towards cities seeking food, only to find the cities starving too. The palace, once a center of redistribution, becomes overwhelmed, unable to sustain the weight of need. Civilization is a contract with nature. When nature breaks that contract, civilization becomes fragile. The Bronze Age collapse is often described through invasions and burning cities, but beneath those visible events lies a deeper, slower force, environmental instability. A world changing its rules, a climate becoming harsher, the earth becoming less predictable, and unpredictability is poison to complex systems, because complexity requires stability. Trade requires safe seas. Agriculture requires rain. Empire requires surplus. When nature becomes uncertain, complexity collapses into survival. The earth turns against its builders, not because it hates them, but because it does not know them. The ground does not care for palaces. The sky does not honor kings. The rivers do not remember empires. Nature is older than civilization, and civilization is always temporary within it. Perhaps that is why the Bronze Age collapse feels so haunting. It is not only a political tragedy. It is an existential one, a reminder that even at the height of human achievement, the world itself remains beyond control. The ancient builders raised stone walls against chaos, but chaos was not only outside the gates, it was beneath their feet. It was in the clouds. It was in the shifting patterns of earth and water. And as the late Bronze Age darkened, the people living through it must have felt something chilling. Not merely that enemies were approaching, but that the world itself was no longer familiar, that the land had changed, that the gods were silent, that the earth was moving, and that civilization, no matter how grand, was built on foundations far more fragile than stone. For when the earth turns, empires tremble, and when the rains do not return, even the greatest palaces begin to feel like ruins waiting to happen. Civilization is not only built from stone, it is built from movement. From roads worn smooth by feet, from ships crossing water with cargo and letters, from the invisible trust that something sent away will return, from the steady circulation of goods, ideas, and memory. The Bronze Age world was held together by exchange, not merely trade in the economic sense, but exchange as a form of life itself. Metal flowed from distant mines, grain traveled from fertile valleys to hungry cities. Diplomatic gifts crossed borders like ritual offerings. Language moved through scribes and envoys. Knowledge traveled in the fragile form of clay tablets, seals, and spoken agreements. The Bronze Age was a networked world. And networks are living things. They depend on connection. When those arteries closed, societies bled out quietly. At first, the breakdown may have seemed subtle. A ship delayed, a port less busy, a caravan that never arrived, a letter unanswered. The ancient world did not have modern supply chains, yet its complexity depended on the same principle, continuity. A palace could not function without imports. A city could not survive without food. An empire could not maintain authority without communication. Exchange was not luxury. It was survival. Bronze itself is the perfect symbol of this dependence. The metal that defined the age required ingredients scattered across geography, copper from one region, tin from another. No kingdom was entirely self-sufficient. The Bronze Age was, in a sense, an age of shared vulnerability. A sword carried the fingerprints of distant lands. A tool carried the proof of trade routes still alive. But when trade faltered, bronze faltered. When bronze faltered, armies weakened. When armies weakened, borders collapsed, and the web began to tear. Collapse is often the moment when connection dies, and isolation becomes fatal. The Bronze Age system was not designed for isolation. Its palaces were administrative hubs dependent on constant inflow, tribute, goods, labor. Its cities were ports of exchange, not self-contained fortresses. Its kings were part of an international order, writing to one another, negotiating alliances, sharing threats. When the arteries of exchange closed, the heart could not keep beating. The breakdown of trade was not only economic, it was psychological. Because trade is a form of reassurance, it tells a society that the world beyond the horizon still exists, still functions, still recognizes you. A ship arriving in port is more than cargo. It is proof of continuity. When ships stop coming, the horizon becomes empty. And emptiness breeds fear. Diplomacy, too, begins to fail. Letters go unanswered. Allies vanish into their own crises. The great brotherhood of kings becomes silence. Each kingdom turns inward, not by choice, but by necessity. Isolation spreads. And isolation is deadly to complex civilizations. Because complexity requires specialization. Specialists require support. Support requires surplus. Surplus requires trade. Trade requires stability. When stability collapses, specialization collapses. The Bronze Age world begins to simplify, not into peace, but into survival. And then there is memory. The breakdown of exchange is also the breakdown of remembrance. Writing in the Bronze Age was often a palace craft. Literacy belonged to scribes, administrators, the machinery of centralized power. When palaces burned, when administrative centers fell, writing disappeared with them. This is one of the most haunting aspects of the collapse. The world did not only lose cities. It lost language. It lost record. It lost the ability to speak to the future. In Greece, the linear B script vanishes after the palaces fall. For centuries, the Greek world enters a kind of silence, not because people stopped living, but because the system that preserved memory collapsed. History becomes archaeology. Ages become dark not because nothing happens, but because the record is gone. The Bronze Age collapse was, in this sense, a collapse of memory itself. When trade breaks, culture fragments, ideas stop traveling, art becomes local, myths shift. The shared cosmopolitan world of the late Bronze Age dissolves into smaller, harsher realities. Connection dies. And when connection dies, the world shrinks. A person who once lived in a city tied to distant shores now lives in a world bounded by immediate land, immediate hunger, immediate fear. The horizon is no longer a promise. It is a void. This is how civilizations bleed out quietly. Not always through dramatic conquest, but through the slow closing of arteries, through isolation spreading like frost, through networks failing until the whole body collapses. The Bronze Age had been a marvel of interdependence, but interdependence is fragile. It creates brilliance, and it creates vulnerability. And when the arteries closed, when metal stopped flowing, when grain stopped arriving, when diplomacy fell silent, when writing vanished, the Bronze Age world did not explode. It faded. It unraveled. It bled out quietly. Collapse is often not a single moment. It is the moment when the world stops reaching outward, when connection becomes impossible, when isolation becomes fatal. And in the quiet that followed, the ancient Mediterranean, once alive with exchange, became a scattering of survivors among ruins, living in the long shadow of a world that had forgotten how to speak to itself. The dream of connection died first. Everything else followed. There is a particular kind of tragedy in the written word, not the tragedy of poetry or of myth, but of administration, of records meant to preserve order, suddenly becoming the last echoes of a dying world. Because writing in the Bronze Age was never casual. It was power made visible. It was the palace speaking through clay. And in the final years, the palace began to speak like a drowning thing. Kings wrote their last letters, pressed into wet tablets sealed with authority, carried across roads and seas that were already breaking apart. Messages sent with urgency, with restraint, with the lingering assumption that someone, somewhere, still held the world together. But no one did. In the ruins of cities like Ugarit, archaeologists have found these final voices preserved in ash. Tablets scattered across floors, unfinished, hurried, abandoned. The words are not epic. They are not dramatic. They are terrifying in their simplicity. Enemy ships are sighted. The coast is threatened. Send help. Send grain. Send soldiers. The kings of the late Bronze Age, who once spoke in the language of eternity, began to speak in the language of need. And need is always more honest than ceremony. These rulers had been raised within systems that felt unshakable. They inherited palaces, armies, diplomatic networks stretching across the Mediterranean. They called one another brothers. They exchanged gifts, brides, treaties. Their world was built on correspondence. So when collapse came, they did what they had always done. They wrote. They appealed to allies. They begged distant powers to remember their obligations. They believed the web would hold, but the web was already tearing. A letter is a fragile thing. It assumes a functioning world. It assumes roads are safe. It assumes messengers will arrive. It assumes the recipient has the capacity to respond. In collapse, those assumptions fail. And so these last letters become monuments not of rescue, but of abandonment. A ruler writes into clay as though clay can summon salvation. But salvation never comes. In one tablet from Ugarit, the king's voice is almost unbearably calm. There is no hysteria, no flourish, only the measured tone of someone trying to maintain order while the horizon burns. It is this calmness that haunts, because history often records its own extinction with terrifying composure. The bureaucratic mind does not scream. It documents. Even as the palace trembles, the scribe presses signs into clay. Even as smoke rises, the king dictates a formal appeal. Even as the city is about to fall, the machinery of civilization continues its rituals of administration. As though writing itself could prevent oblivion, there is something deeply human in that. The refusal to believe the end is truly here. The instinct to reach outward, to ask for help, to trust in systems one last time. Kings writing their last letters are not only rulers. They are people standing at the edge of disappearance. And through these tablets, we glimpse the psychological moment of collapse, not the burning city, but the realization that the world is no longer responding. A letter unanswered is more frightening than an enemy army, because an enemy can be fought. Silence cannot. The late Bronze Age rulers were surrounded by silence. Allies were collapsing too. Trade routes were broken. Grain was scarce. Armies were stretched thin. The great powers of the age were no longer pillars. They were drowning alongside one another. And so the correspondence of kings becomes a chorus of desperation. Not dramatic, not mythic. Administrative despair. A world sinking beneath itself, still trying to communicate as it goes under. These tablets are among the last written traces before the darkness, because when the palaces fell, writing often vanished with them. Literacy was tied to centralized power. The scribes belonged to courts, not villages. When the courts burned, the scribes disappeared, and with them, the ability of civilization to record itself. The Bronze Age collapse is therefore not only the fall of cities, it is the fall of memory. The last letters are the last lights, small clay lamps flickering before the long night. And perhaps that is why they feel so haunting, because they remind us that collapse is not always loud. Sometimes it is paperwork left unfinished, a message sent too late, a plea sealed in clay, never opened, a king believing, until the final moment, that someone will answer. There is something unbearable in the thought of these tablets lying beneath ruins for 3,000 years, holding words meant for rescue that never arrived, help that never came. History does not always end with a roar. Sometimes it ends with a letter, and the quiet, measured handwriting of extinction. After the burning, there is a moment history rarely describes. Not the moment of conquest, not the moment of collapse, but what comes after, when the flames have consumed their last beam, when the survivors have fled or fallen silent, when the world that once felt crowded with meaning becomes empty. This is the long night of abandonment. After the fires, there was emptiness. Cities that had once held thousands of lives became hollow shells. Streets that had echoed with footsteps and commerce were left to dust. Palaces that had stored grain and gold stood broken beneath the sky, their painted walls blackened, their courtyards open to rain. No armies marched in triumph. No new kings sat upon the thrones. There was simply absence. The Bronze Age collapse did not always leave behind occupation. It left behind vacancy. Civilization did not transform neatly into something else. In many places, it simply withdrew. The coastal strongholds that once connected the Mediterranean world were abandoned to weeds and wind. Ports fell quiet. Harbors filled with silt. Trade routes that had carried bronze and wine became empty corridors haunted only by memory. And in that emptiness something deeper began to fade. The voice of civilization itself. Literacy, once the nervous system of palace society, began to disappear. The scribes were gone. The administrative centers that had demanded record-keeping were destroyed. Writing, which had once pinned the world into lists and inventories, suddenly had no home. Clay tablets stopped being pressed. Letters stopped being sent. The world stopped recording itself. It is difficult to grasp what this means. We often imagine writing as inevitable, permanent, universal. But in the ancient world, writing was fragile. It belonged to institutions. When institutions collapsed, literacy could collapse with them. In Greece, the linear B script vanished. For centuries, there is no written Greek record, not because people ceased to exist, but because the system that sustained writing was gone. History enters a silence so deep we call it a dark age. Not darkness of ignorance, but darkness of absence. A world still living, but no longer speaking to us. Generations grew up among ruins without knowing what had been lost. Imagine a child born after the palaces fell. To that child, the broken columns are not symbols of catastrophe. They are simply part of the landscape, as natural as hills. The blackened stones are not remembered as halls of kings. They are shelters, quarries, strange remnants of an older world. The child does not know that ships once arrived daily in the harbor, does not know that kings once wrote letters across seas, does not know that the world had once been wider. This is perhaps the most haunting aspect of collapse. Not that civilization ends, but that it is forgotten. A society can survive ruin, but forgetting is another kind of death. The apocalypse was silent, not explosive. It was not a single dramatic ending, but a slow fading of complexity. Cities shrank into villages. International diplomacy became local survival. Art became simpler. Trade became rare. The grand interconnected Bronze Age web dissolved into scattered points of life, isolated and wary. Civilization simply stopped speaking. The temples may have still stood in places, but the rituals changed. The gods of empire lost their palaces. Religion became smaller, closer to the soil, closer to immediate fear and need. The great mythic narratives of kingship, divine order, cosmic balance felt distant when the world itself had proven unstable. And so, people lived differently. Not in golden halls, but in modest settlements. Not in vast networks, but in narrow horizons. Not with the confidence of permanence, but with the cautious realism of survival. This long night was not empty of humanity. People still married, still worked, still prayed, still told stories. But the world they inhabited was reduced. Like a library after a fire, where only a few scorched pages remain. The Bronze Age collapse reminds us that civilization is not a straight line upward. It can recede. It can become quieter. It can lose knowledge. It can forget itself. And in the centuries after the collapse, the Mediterranean world existed in a kind of twilight. Ruins standing like ghosts of a vanished order, while new generations moved through them without names. The silence is what endures, because silence is not nothing. Silence is the absence of connection, the absence of record, the absence of the old world's voice. The long night of abandonment is history's pause between ages, the space where one civilization has died and another has not yet fully emerged. A liminal world, a world of ash and weeds, a world where the great Bronze Age dream becomes legend, then myth, then barely even that. And perhaps this is why it feels so haunting to us now, because we are listening across 3,000 years, trying to hear a world that stopped speaking, trying to imagine what it meant to live among the ruins of greatness without knowing their story. The palaces fell. The scribes vanished. The seas grew quiet. And civilization, for a long time, became a whisper buried beneath the wind. When a civilization collapses, it does not leave behind only rubble. It leaves behind questions. Questions too heavy for ordinary language. Questions that cannot be answered by broken walls or empty granaries. Questions that linger in the minds of survivors like smoke that will not clear. Why did the world end? Who allowed it? What did we do wrong? And in the silence where history disappears, something else always rises to fill the void. Myth. Myth is not the opposite of truth. Myth is what human beings create when truth is unbearable, incomplete, or too vast to hold. It is the shape we give to catastrophe when the record is gone and only memory remains. Where history disappeared, myth stepped in. After the Bronze Age collapse, the great palaces were gone. The scribes were silent. The diplomatic letters stopped. The interconnected world that had once felt permanent dissolved into scattered survival. But people did not stop speaking. They spoke differently. They began to tell stories. Survivors turned catastrophe into legend. Because when you cannot explain collapse through politics or climate, you explain it through gods. When you cannot trace the slow fractures of empire, you imagine a single dramatic cause, a punishment, a curse, a monster. The human mind does not tolerate randomness well. We crave meaning even in ruin, especially in ruin. And so the Bronze Age collapse became more than an event. It became a memory transformed, a mythic scar. The gods became explanations. In the ancient world, divinity was never distant from disaster. Earthquakes were not geology. They were divine anger. Drought was not climate. It was abandonment. Invasion was not migration. It was fate. When the Bronze Age world fell apart, the survivors needed to believe it had a reason, that the universe was still ordered, even if cruel. And so they looked upward. Perhaps the gods had been insulted. Perhaps kings had grown arrogant. Perhaps rituals had failed. Perhaps humanity had broken the cosmic contract. This is how myth begins, as theology under pressure. But myth is also psychology. Because catastrophe leaves behind trauma, and trauma seeks narrative. It seeks a way to be carried. A people who have watched cities burn cannot simply forget. They cannot live with pure emptiness. The mind turns horror into symbol because symbol is survivable. Monsters become metaphors. The sea peoples, those shadowy figures on the horizon, could become demons in later memory, faceless destroyers rather than displaced humans. Famine could become a curse. The long night of abandonment could become an age of giants, or gods withdrawing, or heroes wandering through ruins. In Greece, centuries after the collapse, stories emerge of a lost, heroic age. An age of great kings, of shining citadels, of epic wars. The Trojan War, whether rooted in history or not, feels like myth shaped by collapse, a memory of palatial power, of coastal burning, of a world ending in flame. Homer's epics are not Bronze Age records. They are echoes, ruins speaking through poetry. And in those echoes we feel what was lost, not through inventories, but through longing. Myth preserves emotion when history cannot preserve fact. It preserves the feeling of a world that vanished. This is why myths often emerge strongest after collapse. Because collapse creates gaps, and gaps invite imagination. A ruined city becomes haunted. An abandoned palace becomes the home of spirits. A dark age becomes the time when gods walked away. The collapse became a story humanity told itself to survive what it could not understand. Stories are survival tools. They take chaos and give it shape. They allow a community to mourn collectively. They allow suffering to become meaningful, even if the meaning is invented, even if the gods are silent. In the centuries after the Bronze Age collapse, people rebuilt in smaller ways. They lived among fragments. They passed down memories without writing, without archives, without certainty. And in that oral world, memory changes. Facts blur. Symbols sharpen. History becomes myth not because people lie, but because myth is what remains when detail fades. A city's fall becomes a tale of divine wrath. A migration becomes a legend of monstrous invaders. A drought becomes a curse upon the land. Myth is history's shadow. And perhaps it is also history's afterlife. Because the Bronze Age collapse did not vanish completely. It endured in stories, in gods, in fears, in metaphors of a world once connected, now broken. Myth, born from ruins, is humanity's attempt to keep speaking when civilization itself has gone quiet. The palaces fell. The writing disappeared. But the imagination remained. And in the darkness of the long night, people did what humans have always done. They told stories into the firelight, not to entertain, but to remember. Not the facts, perhaps, but the feeling of the end. The feeling of standing among ruins and sensing that the world had once been larger. Myth is what we build when history collapses. A bridge made of symbol over an abyss of silence. And somewhere beneath every legend of gods and monsters, beneath every heroic age and cursed downfall, there is a real human catastrophe still echoing, a civilization erased, and the fragile, enduring need to make sense of what remains. Collapse is never the end of humanity. It is the end of a world. And after the Bronze Age fell into silence, after palaces burned and trade routes emptied, after writing vanished, and cities became weeds and stone, life continued, not triumphantly, not cleanly, but stubbornly. Out of the darkness came smaller societies, harsher realities, and the slow rebuilding of order. The long night of abandonment did not last forever. It could not. Human beings do not remain in ruin indefinitely. Even in the deepest fractures of history, there is always the quiet labor of survival, people planting again, gathering again, shaping new lives out of broken landscapes. But the world that emerged was not the world that had been lost. The Iron Age was not a continuation. It was a rebirth shaped by trauma. The Bronze Age had been an age of palaces, centralized power, vast networks, bureaucratic administration. Its collapse shattered that complexity. What followed was smaller, more fragmented, more local. Empires did not immediately return. Instead, there were villages, hilltop settlements, communities bound by proximity rather than international diplomacy. The Mediterranean world shrank. Horizons narrowed. Life became harder, simpler, closer to the soil. Where once kings exchanged letters across seas, now survival was measured in harvests and defenses, in immediate threats rather than distant alliances. The great cosmopolitan system of bronze and tribute dissolved into scattered points of endurance. And yet from that endurance, something new began to form. Iron replaced bronze. Not suddenly, not as a technological revolution alone, but as necessity. Bronze required trade, tin, interconnected stability. Iron was more widely available. It could be forged locally. In a fractured world, iron was a metal of survival. The shift in material was also a shift in civilization's shape. Iron democratized weaponry. It changed warfare. It altered power structures. The old palatial monopolies weakened, and new forms of authority began to rise. Tribal leaders, warrior elites, emerging city-states. The world was rebuilding, but differently. And rebuilding after collapse is never innocent. Because trauma leaves residue. Every new civilization carried the ghost of the old one beneath its foundations. In Greece, After centuries of silence, new societies began to grow. The Dark Age gave way to the Archaic period, to city-states, to renewed writing, to Homer's epics, stories that looked backward toward a lost, heroic age. The ruins of Mycenaean palaces were still there, looming like shadows of forgotten grandeur. People lived among them, built near them, repurposed their stones. The past was not gone. It was buried, but present. In the Levant, Phoenician cities rose along the coast, smaller but resilient, carrying forward seafaring traditions into a new age. Their ships would one day stitch the Mediterranean together again, but the network would not be the same. The memory of collapse lingered in caution, in adaptation. In Anatolia and Mesopotamia, new powers emerged, Assyria growing into an empire of iron discipline, harsher and more militarized than the palatial kingdoms before. The post-collapse world was less delicate, less interconnected by trust, more shaped by force, because collapse teaches brutality. It teaches that stability is not guaranteed. It teaches that power must be defended relentlessly. The Bronze Age dream had been one of balance. The Iron Age rebirth was one of resilience, and beneath all of it was memory. Even when writing disappeared, even when records fell silent, people remembered in other ways, through oral tradition, through myth, through the haunted awareness that a greater world had once existed and had been lost. The ghost of the Bronze Age lived in stories of fallen cities, in legends of heroic kings, in the sense that history could break. The new world rose from ash, but ash does not vanish. It settles into the soil. It becomes part of what grows next. Civilizations are like forests. After fire, new growth comes, but the scars remain in the rings of trees, in the altered landscape, in the knowledge that it can burn again. The Iron Age was not merely recovery. It was transformation, a world reshaped by catastrophe, carrying forward fragments of the old order while building something new atop its ruins. And perhaps this is the enduring lesson of the Bronze Age collapse. History does not move in straight lines. It fractures. It forgets. It rebuilds. Every civilization is both inheritance and improvisation. Every new order stands upon the remains of something older, whether it knows it or not. The palaces fell. Scribes vanished. The seas grew quiet, but humanity remained. And from the darkness, slowly, painfully, deliberately, a new world began to rise, not untouched, not unscarred, but alive, with the ghost of the old world beneath its foundations, whispering a warning into every stone. Nothing that humans build is permanent. Everything can collapse. And yet, even from ash, we begin again. There is a temptation, when we look back at ancient collapse, to treat it as distance, as something sealed safely in the past, a tragedy belonging to people who lived beneath different skies, who worshipped different gods, who built with bronze instead of steel. But the Bronze Age collapse does not feel distant. It feels familiar in its shape, because it is not only a story of ancient cities, it is a story of civilization itself. The Bronze Age collapse remains history's quiet apocalypse. Not quiet because it was gentle. Cities burned, people starved, kingdoms vanished. But quiet because it did not arrive with one clear moment of ending. There was no single final battle that closed the age, no decisive event that made the world understand what was happening. Instead, it was a slow disappearance, a system unraveling, a network failing, a world going silent, and perhaps that is why it haunts us. Because it reminds us that apocalypse is not always fire from the heavens. Sometimes it is simply the closing of arteries, the breaking of connection, the fading of memory. Complexity can vanish overnight. The late Bronze Age was one of the most interconnected worlds humanity had yet built. Trade routes spanned seas, diplomacy linked kings, palaces stored surplus, writing preserved order. The system was intricate, advanced, luminous. and then it was gone. Not because humans suddenly forgot how to build, but because the conditions that allowed complexity to thrive collapsed. Empires fall not only by conquest, but by hunger, climate, migration, and fragility. That is the lesson civilization rarely wants to hear. We prefer simple narratives. An enemy invades, a kingdom falls, a new power rises. But the Bronze Age collapse resists simplicity. It was not one enemy. It was many pressures converging. Drought weakened harvests. Famine eroded trust. Earthquakes shattered walls. Trade routes failed. Migratory movements surged. Rivalries simmered. The Sea Peoples arrived as both symptom and catalyst. And the interconnected web that held the world together tore strand by strand. Collapse was not a single blow. It was systemic fragility revealed. The Bronze Age world was balanced like a palace built on many pillars. Remove one and the structure trembles. Remove several and it falls, not dramatically but inevitably. And when it fell, it did not only destroy cities. It destroyed continuity. Writing vanished. Memory broke. Generations grew up among ruins without knowing what had been lost. Civilization stopped speaking. This is perhaps the most chilling truth. Collapse is not only destruction, it is forgetting. The Bronze Age became myth because history could no longer hold it. Where records ended, legends began. Survivors turned catastrophe into stories of gods and monsters because myth is what humans create when reality is too vast, too painful, too incomprehensible. But beneath the myth, the human question lingers. How close are we always to forgetting our own world? That question is the true warning. Not because history repeats in identical form, but because civilization is always more fragile than it appears. Every society believes in some quiet way that it is stable, that its systems are permanent, that its complexity is irreversible. The Bronze Age kings believed the same. They sat beneath painted ceilings surrounded by stored grain and written records, confident that order would endure. And then they wrote their last letters. They begged for help that never came. They watched the horizon fill with shadows. They saw the world they knew dissolve. The warning civilization never hears is that civilization is not a mountain. It is a flame. It burns brightly, but it depends on conditions, fuel, balance, care, stability. When those conditions change, the flame can go out faster than anyone expects. And the world that seemed eternal becomes ruin. The Bronze Age collapse is not only a story of loss, it is a mirror, a reminder that human achievement is extraordinary, but not invincible, that networks can break, that climate can shift, that hunger can rot faith, that migration can reshape borders, that complexity carries vulnerability within it, and that history's greatest apocalypses are often the quiet ones, the ones that arrive not with spectacle, but with silence. The ancient Mediterranean once glittered with cities like constellations. Then the lights went out, and for centuries the world lived among their ashes, telling stories to explain what could not be understood. Perhaps that is what remains for us now, not simply the ruins, but the warning written between them. That no civilization is beyond collapse. That forgetting is always possible. That the world we inhabit, however stable it feels, is still held together by fragile agreements between humans, between systems, between earth and sky. And somewhere beneath our own confidence, the Bronze Age whispers its final question across 3,000 years of silence. How close are we to the edge of our own long night?